Chapter 13. 7 Years of Famine. Sometime later, Joseph's brothers arrived safely at their home in Canaan. When Jacob, their father, saw that 11 of them had returned safely, he was very happy. "I thank God that you are back," he exclaimed as he hurried to embrace them. "Now if I only could see your brother Joseph again." "Joseph is alive!" "You will!" one of the sons shouted excitedly. "Joseph is alive! We found him in Egypt!" This remark startled Jacob, but also it saddened him more because he thought the speaker was unwisely just trying to cheer him up. When the other sons loudly echoed the same news and that Joseph had become the governor of Egypt under Pharaoh, Jacob had to believe them. He was so moved that he fainted with relief and joy. Later, when he was shown the gifts and bags of grain from Egypt, and the carriages for his trip there, he was overjoyed at the prospect of going to see Joseph. Jacob journeys to Egypt. Before long, Jacob, his sons, their families, servants, and animals were moving southwestward. The carriages Pharaoh had sent made travel less difficult for small children and the elderly. Being 130 years old, Jacob appreciated journeying in such awesome comfort. At the same time, he began to be concerned at remembering that God had forbidden his grandfather Abraham to go into Egypt. His worries about this ended when God told him in a vision that he meant Jacob to go there, and promised him a return to Canaan. Genesis chapter 46, verses 1 through 4. As soon as Joseph heard that his father's caravan had reached Egypt, he drove out in his chariot with some of his cavalrymen to meet the visitors. The reunion of a fond father and long-lost son was a joyous one. Jacob felt that his life was so full that he didn't mind if it ended then. Happily, he was to live for several more eventful years. Joseph tells Pharaoh. "Pharaoh will want you to appear before him," Joseph told his father and brothers after informing the king that his family had arrived. "When he asks what you do for a living, truthfully tell him that you tend cattle and sheep. Even though most Egyptians regard animals as sacred and don't like shepherds and drovers because they seldom think animals are sacred." Pharaoh at first asked 5 of Joseph's brothers to come before him. As Joseph had predicted, the king inquired about their occupations. When he learned that they dealt in cattle and sheep, he suggested to Joseph that they settle in the Egyptian area of Goshen. Joseph had hoped that Pharaoh would do that. The best nearby pastures were in Goshen. Besides, there were fewer Egyptians there who would trouble outsiders who lacked the belief that animals should be worshipped. Jacob later was brought to Pharaoh, who treated him with honor because of the respect for Joseph. The king saw that all of Jacob's family were settled in the rich Nile River Delta land, the section of Egypt nearest Canaan. Weeks passed during which Joseph had the opportunity to occasionally visit his father and his brothers and their families. Meanwhile, the famine grew worse. Those who had lived too luxuriously during the 7 good years were first to feel the shortage of food. Joseph sent word to all nations that farm animals would be accepted by Pharaoh as payment for grain. After the animals had been turned in, there was a period of less complaint. Before long, though, people were again begging for grain. The only way they could pay this time was to turn their land over to Pharaoh, who soon became the nation's wealthiest landlord. Many of the land that didn't belong to him was retained by priests of Egyptian pagan religions. The food problem increased with each passing day, but Joseph believed that the end of the famine was near. When 7 years were almost up, he started moving the people back to the farms they had left. "Pharaoh now owns your land," he told them, "but he will give you seed for starting new crops. In return, you must give him 1/5 of each of your harvests." The people considered this fair, though not many felt certain that the famine was about to end. After the end of the 7th year, when rain returned and crops again began to spring up in abundance, the Egyptians had even higher regard for Joseph. Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt. His children's families increased greatly in numbers. Because God had given Jacob the name of Israel, Jacob's descendants were called Israelites, a nation that developed inside Egypt. Believing that his life was about over, Jacob sent for Joseph and his 2 young sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob adopts Joseph's children as his own. God told me years ago that I would be the father of a great nation, and that those who live after me would be given the land of Canaan. Jacob told Joseph, I want to adopt your sons as mine to make sure they remain part of our family instead of mixing with the Egyptians. Joseph agreed. He brought his sons to where his father, who had become weak and partially blind, rested on his bed. Jacob fondly hugged his grandsons, observing that it was a great blessing from God to live to see them. He sat up to pray for them, placing his left hand on Manasseh's head and his right hand on Ephraim's. Thinking that his father was too blind to see which boy was which, Joseph gently removed Jacob's left hand from Manasseh's head. It is the custom that the right hand be on the firstborn, Joseph said. Manasseh is the older. I realize I put my right hand on the head of the younger one, Jacob explained. The greatest nation of the earth will come from Manasseh, but a commonwealth of nations will come from Ephraim. Jacob then asked God to cause mighty nations to come from each of the boys. Genesis chapter 48, verse 19. Then, knowing that his death was near, he asked to see all of his sons. A prophecy for today. Jacob was inspired by God in what he said, for he told each son a little of what each vast tribe would be like in the far future. He had the most to say about Joseph, whom he said would spread out into the wealthiest nations in the world. Now, thousands of years later, we learn through the Bible that Joseph was the father of English-speaking nations. When we read what is foretold to happen to Ephraim, we know that it means Great Britain. And then we read what is to happen to Manasseh, we know that it means the United States of America. Only in recent years, just as he said he would do, has God let us understand these things. Jacob died right after speaking to his sons. Joseph ordered Egyptian physicians to prepare his father's body for burial by an Egyptian method known as embalming. This took many days, and then was followed by a long period of mourning by the Egyptians. At last, Joseph and his brothers and their families, except their very young children, along with a great number of Egyptian officials, soldiers, and servants, started off with Jacob's body for Canaan. It was a trip of 300 miles, and therefore this must have been one of the greatest funeral processions in history. Genesis chapter 50, verses 7 through 13. This great ceremony for Jacob wasn't just because the Egyptians held Jacob in such high regard. It was mostly because they thought of his son Joseph as a national hero because he had saved their nation from starvation. Jacob lived 147 years. Some might have thought of him as a very plain, unimportant man, but he had a very necessary part in God's plan in bringing into being the great nation of Israel, the nation God chose to help him in a wonderful plan.